listening to the Chorus One podcast, a show that covers decentralized networks and their impact on the evolution of automated and borderless economies. On this podcast, we invite pioneers and builders to discuss the decentralized protocols and projects they are working on. On this show today, we have Scott Sigel, Director of Operations for the Decentralized Wireless Alliance. Helium Network is a novel decentralized network because it is not just a blockchain or an application, but a worldwide decentralized physical wireless network powered by hotspots. The wireless network is known as LongFi and incorporates state-of-the-art wireless network tech with blockchain. Companies use Helium Network as a cost-effective alternative to track their IoT devices, and network participants set up hotspots to earn H&T rewards. We have Scott on the show today to talk about their newly announced transition to a proof-of-stake network and cover things ranging from hotspots to consensus to their ambitions to build the world's first user-owned 5G network.
Hi, and welcome to the Chorus One podcast. Today we have a very special guest, Scott Sigel, working with the Helium Network. Hi, Scott, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me.
So, Scott, thanks so much for coming on today and taking the time to speak with us. So, pretty excited about this podcast today. So, you're with Helium Network, which is a really unique sort of blockchain and cryptocurrency compared to the rest in the ecosystem. Can you please sort of just give a brief overview of what Helium Network is?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, introduction, Scott Sigel. I run operations for the Helium Foundation, which is also known publicly as the Decentralized Wireless Alliance. And Helium refers to both a blockchain and then a decentralized wireless network of physical hotspots around the world. So if you think about the Helium blockchain, it's really the economic layer of what's actually incentivizing the creation of a physical wireless network. And then the actual wireless network itself, which, it's kind of community coined lovingly the people's network. Really the idea that you're talking about wireless infrastructure globally that's really stood up by individuals around the world. So one of the analogies that we kind of feel like connects with people is the Airbnb analogy, in the same way that you had a home, you had your own structure, that there was a platform that allowed you to participate in the upside of providing hospitality. So similarly with Helium, you've got a home, you've got real estate, you've got power, connectivity. So rather than necessarily large enterprise who stand up towers around the world, it's an opportunity for people to actually provide that wireless infrastructure themselves and get rewarded for it.
And I'm really interested in terms of, the people's network, as you coined it, somewhat similar to almost what Bitcoin was like back in the day, when you had miners. You have one element in Helium Network called hotspots, but before we get into that and how that's mined, I'm interested, how was the decision made to use cryptocurrency to incentivize people to set up this network?
Yeah, it's actually, I think the origin story kind of is a good piece of that, because Helium's actually been around for several years, and cryptocurrency was not part of the original concept. It started with Amir Helium, who is the founder of Helium, who met Sean Fanning, which some people would remember as one of the founders of Napster. And they got together, I think it was around 2012 or so, where they got together and they were talking about this need where IoT, or Internet of Things, connected devices, low power things that are telling you something's on, off, working, not working. There wasn't really a network that existed in the world for that. You couldn't use something like Wi-Fi because of obviously the power involved and what the actual radius as far as coverage from the house. And then cellular was just prohibitively expensive. You couldn't necessarily have some sort of trackable dog collar that had its own Vodafone carrier plan. It just wouldn't be economically feasible for the company or the consumer. So they got together and thinking about the idea of, sensors are ultimately going to be everywhere, and where's the network to actually build for that? And they looked at a lot of options on how to actually build that out. And other networks and other companies have tried to do this. And doing this from a centralized perspective is incredibly hard, just how capitally intensive it is to actually stand up a network and build that out. The amount of capital you have to raise or borrow just makes it very, very difficult to actually build and bootstrap a network. So fast forward several years, and that's kind of where the blockchain element actually came in, is really the idea of how can you have a way of creating that incentive for people to build out a network, get rewarded for it, effectively having sort of like micropayments of how that's actually being rewarded, but also the novel idea of how can you actually validate that coverage and have security that shows that people are actually providing that coverage, that it exists, and that it is being checked through this kind of decentralized protocol. So blockchain actually solves these two things in a very novel way, as far as rewarding the early users, but then also having the proof of coverage concept. So that's really where the blockchain came in.
And yeah, so you've touched on a few things there, including hotspots and proof of coverage. And so I think now might be a nice time to sort of touch in a bit more detail into what these are. And so, in our research, we're onboarding Helium Network, which is really exciting in the coming weeks. And so in our research, we sort of took it down and stripped it down to four sort of core primitives in Helium, which is like hotspots, like you mentioned. You've got proof of coverage, which is checking where the hotspots are in these locations.
Yep.
You've also got a new type of consensus called Honey Badger, which I think might be used in XDI chain as well. And then, you've just got a variety of different things, also in terms of the proof of coverage, etc. Can you touch upon these sort of core primitives that make up Helium Network in itself and what the roles they all play?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can kind of start with the hotspot, since it's just so important to the fact of Helium not just being a blockchain, but really a physical network where people participate. And again, going back to your point about Bitcoin mining, this feels like to me, and again, I've worked on about I think 4 different crypto projects to date, something where people feel very connected. It's very democratized access to mining. The fact that you've got an actual physical piece of hardware that's either in your home, on your roof, somewhere that you've deployed out. It's interesting. I talked to so many people in our community. There's an emotional attachment to it because you have a physical object. So while we're all living in a physical world and we're excited about everything around NFTs and different tokens, something about actually having that kind of mining / gateway, really, that's part of your interaction with Helium is pretty cool. And it's made people really strong believers because they can actually see the utility. So I think with hotspots, it's not that it's any sort of complicated piece of hardware, actually. It's more that there's an elegance in the fact of something that's so consumer friendly. It's something that I've seen across the entire blockchain or decentralized ecosystems of something that is user friendly and a pleasant experience can sometimes be, it was rare for several years. I think now we're seeing a lot of great things on kind of software and front end side. But it was so important to actually design something that was easy for non-native crypto people. And when the Helium Inc. team started along that path, so much around the actual app for looking at rewards, seeing kind of coverage in your area, who is actually witnessing, and we'll talk more about proof of coverage, but how simple it is to actually get home, unbox a hotspot, plug it in, put it up in your window, and now you're providing coverage for 5 to 10 miles kind of on average of coverage. And part of that is, and something that's kind of important to delineate here is, Helium launched on, LoRaWAN, which is a global standard as a network. So the same way you've got, LTE, 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. LoRaWAN is not as known, I think, in retail and consumers, but it's a network for IoT devices. So low power, long range. So something that's also great about Helium is, there's all these discussions around Bitcoin and proof of work and how much energy. Helium is an incredibly low consumption network. I mean, we're talking about, I think a hotspot uses about the same as like a 10-watt light bulb. So very energy efficient network. And the idea that the hotspot itself is both a gateway and a miner just bundled into one. So you are both providing and verifying coverage, but you're also transmitting data for sensors. So again, the idea that you've got something up in your house, whether it's a scooter that goes by, so Lime Scooters was a user of the network, the trackable dog collar, air sensors for a municipality, if they're tracking that, any sort of water metering, your hotspot is actually helping those devices connect to the network. And while you're doing that, you're actually earning rewards. So probably good to actually segue into kind of the proof of coverage bit, because that's the other side of it, is so in addition to mining for data transfer, what we really need to have, and I say we, the Helium network, some way, again, you had to be able to bootstrap coverage. How are people actually, what is the incentive for an individual to go and buy a hotspot, put it in their house, and then provide coverage out to any sort of sensors and devices in the area. And that's where proof of coverage comes in, and the novelty of both having the security for the network, but also rewards. So what happens with proof of coverage is you've got three players that are involved there. And so you've got a challenger, a beacon, and a witness. So not to get kind of too into the specifics of it, but proof of coverage is really a work algorithm where you're continuously verifying, calling out to other hotspots in the sense of, are you on? Are you working? Are you transmitting data? So hotspots are chosen at random. I think it's something like every 240 blocks where you can submit a challenge from your gateway, and that'll call out to another hotspot in the network that will then solve that challenge. But then it's all the witnesses in the area, and this is part of the concept is all of these witnesses, all these hotspots that are nearby are saying, okay, we see that you've sent that packet, we see that's received and been broadcast, so now it's confirmed that you can actually see, and again, you can look at this on our Explorer, actually look at all the different hotspots in there, and there's all the receipts from proof of coverage to see who is actually witnessing, and that's part of kind of the novelty of how we actually are maintaining that there is actual physical coverage of a network. And you're rewarded for doing those challenges, you're rewarded for witnessing them and being a beacon. So, even before there's large amounts of data being transferred from sensors and devices, you are being rewarded just for providing that coverage. And that's how we've been able to bootstrap the network from, an initial launch, I think in Austin in 2019 to now, I think we're just over 53,000 hotspots worldwide. And I believe the backlog, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of hotspots now that have been pre-ordered or backlogged to get released. So coverage is just growing, rapidly right now.
Nice. And is there a certain limit you need to make this proof of coverage work? Like in a certain area, you need a bunch of hotspots. Is there some number there or?
Yeah, it obviously it depends so much on line of sight and density. The good thing about LoRaWAN as a global standard is because you're talking about low power devices that are lower frequency, they can travel through walls and concrete. So in a decently urban environment, you're still getting about kind of a 5-mile radius. You're out somewhere rural where it's flat and there's not too many obstructions. I think we've seen things of tens of, 10, 20, 30 miles of coverage. I think I heard something outrageous of a hotspot that was doing something upwards of 100 miles. I don't know if there's truth to it, but again, the idea that you can really cover a city in 100, depending on the city size, but 100, 150 hotspots, you've got pretty healthy coverage. And one of the things we're doing now is thinking about the optimization of that. So on the one hand, people actually go out and volunteers in the community are excited to do this. They're physically mapping and ensuring there's coverage there. But at the same time, we've put out a few grants to people who are looking at very creative ways of how do you actually look at the gaps in the city. So something like I think one of the grant recipients is using the City of London as a test bed to see if I'm going across the city, where there are actually pockets where there's a little bit of a gap, because what we're at now is there's coverage, it's solid. We're seeing a lot of small business and hobbyists who are standing up a lot of sensors. But what comes now is where a lot of larger corporates and enterprises are looking at this for supply chain asset tracking coverage, where they want to be able to rely on the network for that because the economics are so advantageous to a business who wants to deploy on this network.
It all sounds very futuristic, but yeah, it's really interesting. One question I would like to know, where have you seen the most sort of growth in terms of countries that are setting up hotspots maybe, and also companies? I know you mentioned Lime users, so I sort of see it more like business to business, where the people using Helium are the customers with devices that maybe want to be located, like Lime scooters. So yeah, countries and maybe companies where you might be seeing growth with Helium in recent times.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the fact that a lot of the project team is in the U.S. and a lot of the community kind of originated there. There's a lot of coverage that started in U.S. urban areas and it just kind of expanded out from there. If you look at the Explorer right now, it's incredible how much in just a short period of time, really, looking at a year where the U.S., I think more Western Europe, but we're still seeing a lot of that rolling out in Eastern Europe as well. China recently really lit up in the last few months, where we had almost no coverage in January. You look at the map of China right now, and it's absolutely exploding with hotspot coverage. So it's really exciting to see that there. And one of the things that's great about the community and how invested they are is people are actually going and pursuing because you need spectrum access. I mean, in the US, it's kind of open under, I think, like an Apache open source standard. So there's just access to that spectrum. But in different countries where people, not necessarily just hotspot hosts, but businesses who see the value of this, where they can effectively go out, buy a hotspot from one of the third-party manufacturers in the network, stand up coverage themselves, earn on the rewards of that, but then now they have a wireless network they can actually use for, again, any sort of asset tracking, metering. There's just such a host of IoT use cases. I think one that's been really great, and one of the companies that's been in touch with us is looking at life science, refrigeration. You have to have temperature tracking, especially as you're moving, things like COVID vaccines. How do you actually maintain that temperature is consistent? How do you make sure that assets are where they need to be? So a lot of different, the use cases in IoT, and they go far beyond Helium, but the fact that we are providing the Helium network providing this global coverage for low power devices, how economically advantageous it is to deploy on that. I think, where coverage has started in North America, Europe, and Southeast Asia, I think it's just going to continue to expand because there's such an incentive, both from hosts who see the potential for rewards and being part of that infrastructure, but also like the end using companies who just have seen, if we deploy this out, not only is the return on capital great from a hotspot perspective as a host, but now they have this network to use as a business. So, I think, again, some of the other cases where Airly is a great one, where I believe it was actually a couple marathon runners were based in, I think it was Poland, and they're, what's the best time to run during the day? Clean air cases. And now we're seeing, municipalities having this interest of, it's easy to actually deploy these sensors out. It's easy to have a network within your city that can manage for air quality. And as far as resource management for municipalities, so things around water metering. Salesforce, I know, had their own instance of kind of running kind of asset tracking for, I think, something with new hires. Again, it's been a bit, so I don't always recall the exact circumstances, but it's just been really exciting to see not just what type of companies are coming in, but the inspiration for, where else sensors can be deployed, the excitement for the network, how much it actually benefits businesses who don't have that high capital cost of either trying to bootstrap a network or look to cellular as a solution, which is just so not viable for these low power devices. So it's been great to see the growth and just how much that excitement actually just keeps compounding now.
I think I would have one question, like on, let's say you're talking about these use cases, then they kind of tap into that network. Is there like a choice also for me as a business to like only take a certain part of the network, or am I always like kind of tapping into the entire network? Or how, maybe if I have like some private data that I don't want like everyone to see, is there something you are tackling too?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. So number one is the networks basically has privacy by default, and the idea that transactions can't be censored, which kind of gets back to the honey badger question in terms of why that was chosen around like security and enabling trustless key generation. So the fact that the network is effectively like it's private, you can do with it as you will as a user. Also you can, if you want to register an OUI and kind of route your own data, again, like the Helium console is completely open sourced right now. So if you want to be running and routing that data yourself and kind of managing your own privacy, that's completely an option. Again, the network wants to allow for choice for end users. But as far as actually network use, you can almost think of it as like a pay-as-you-go cell plan so this is actually, I think, a really important novel piece, is that for certain networks where you have different tokens, or that the token that is actually part of the infrastructure is also how you pay to use the network, those things are segmented and separate here. So what's great is that anybody who's providing that infrastructure coverage and earning the Helium tokens, it's different for users completely. Users come in and they actually are able to get onto the network using something that's it's Helium data credits. And the way that Helium data credits are created, so first of all, that experience from an end user. So if you think about the fact of somebody who wants to deploy asset trackers, they can just buy all those data credits with US dollars. They don't necessarily need to know or care what's happening under the hood. They can just do that directly through a portal where you're buying data credits, and it's just an amount of data that can be used in the network. So again, that kind of like pay-as-you-go cell plan, you want to transmit roughly some amount of forwarding some amount of bytes to the network, and you just buy that amount, and as that starts to get lower, you just kind of top it up and refresh it as needed. And data credits that's a fixed number, so there's nothing around kind of inflation, deflation, anything that's related to the Helium token. In the sense that Helium tokens are burned to create data credits. So yeah, you might be able to get more or less data credits, but the fact that it's a fixed number, and I think it's 0.0001 US cents to actually get a data credit. That's a fixed number, so it's very, very predictable. It's easy. Anybody who's not crypto native doesn't have to worry about how much they're actually spending to deploy devices onto the network. Now that said, in order to create data credits, what's actually happening under the hood, this is again great from the economic perspective, is you're actually burning Helium tokens each time a data credit is created. So what that does, that's part of our burn and mint kind of equilibrium model, is Helium tokens are burned, they create data credits, but we also have a cap of there's only 223 million Helium tokens that will ever exist. So while Helium tokens are burned, data credits are created, and those data credits are used to actually power and connect sensors and network. As those sensors are going by somebody's house with a hotspot, now that hotspot is mining and creating new Helium tokens. So again, you've got this great equilibrium balance where it's effectively long-term deflationary, but at the same time, there's always going to be an incentive for people to be running the infrastructure and running hotspots. So it's a really novel system that works incredibly well for motivating both sides.
And that was, the fourth pillar you just mentioned then that was escaping me earlier was the data credits concept. And it's really novel. The buyback and burn mechanism really gives the token utility, and I think is what really drives, HNT forward. And so, just before you mentioned the growth, we were talking about how fast Helium is growing. And so you've recently, or governance has recently made the decision to transition to a proof of stake network. So you mentioned the previous proof of coverage, which is where hotspots were sending and receiving data, but then also participating in the consensus group, where I believe they were rewarded with about 6% of inflation, which is fixed, and then halving as well, like you mentioned before. And so, now I believe it's HIP 25 has been passed with the introduction of validators. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you think this transition will really help to power the future of Helium forward.
Yeah, I think it's a really fantastic transition. That's great for the network. It's great for the community. Everybody was very much on board when the proposal was put out. And so I think, again, for context's sake, you consider the fact of it's very, very democratized mining where you've got this global network participating not just in the proof of coverage, not just in data transfer, but also in consensus. So on one hand, really, really ambitious and aspirational of the original core design, which I loved the idea, but from a security and scalability perspective, it's really hard to actually scale that out, especially if we want to kind of grow beyond what's our current 16 consensus member group. Getting that up to a larger number, the hardware is just not powerful enough to do that. And again, thinking about the growth of the network, we want those hotspots to continue to get cheaper and work on kind of more commodity hardware. So think about the sense that if you have all these hotspots, gateways, miners, again, they're all effectively, it's one and the same thing. They're running on consumer grade internet. So if somebody selected at random to join a consensus group, if they've got an internet outage issue, somebody flipped the plug and that hotspot was plugged in the wall, like now you're starting to hold up block propagation and you're actually slowing the network because it's running on, kind of crappy consumer connections, depending on where people are. So you run into an issue around scalability. So from a security perspective, it's just better to be moving things onto, again, more, cloud-based, running kind of on cloud-based rigs with better internet connectivity, less prone to anything like a DDoS attack. So the idea was moving the consensus group out to validators and also creating, again, that security model where now you've got that economic lockup, really aligning with people who can see the long-term vision and it actually from a rewards perspective too. So people have asked, well, if the validator group is moving, if the consensus group is moving over to validators, am I missing out on that 6%? And technically that might be true, but I actually think the odds are better now for anybody who's participating because to be chosen at random from tens of thousands and what will eventually be hundreds of thousands and millions of hotspots, it's just unlikely that you would ever be able to earn on those. We're now with a consensus group that is, orders of magnitude smaller, still in the hundreds, more likely that you get chosen for that. But it really came down to the fact that we really wanted to think about uptime, network scalability. So bringing consensus over to validators is just really, I think, just so good for the entire network. in the stability of the blockchain, uptime, reliability. Then obviously, true with any proof of stake network, having that security of people who are locked up to help secure the network. And people are really excited about that.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about. So you're saying basically, right, in the beginning it was hotspots that participate in consensus. They didn't really bond HNT tokens themselves. Basically, every hotspot had to participate, and everyone was paid the same, no matter what they did. Is that true, or like?
Well, I mean, well, when you say being paid the same, you put it this way: everybody had the same chance of getting
Chance? Yeah, exactly. Okay.
the same odds of getting selected for the consensus.
Okay. Yeah. No, totally. Yeah, and now it's changing to a different model where basically there is a certain set amount of HNT tokens that you need to stake to run a node, right?
Correct.
Yeah, maybe can you talk a little bit about how that works and maybe how you imagine people that have HNT like interacting with this system?
Sure. So as far as kind of the specs, so first thing is that the number of tokens. So it's 10,000 HNT to run a validator, and that was something that was really discussed, amongst the community and the core devs. And 10,000 just it felt like the right number at the time. Again, this is earlier this year, so again, don't like to always talk about price, but again, just for the sake of this conversation, HNT was significantly lower in the beginning of the year, and the 10,000 felt like this is high enough for serious people who really want to secure the network and participate in this, but still low enough that it would allow enough community participation and get us to the numbers that we want to see in terms of at least 100 people opting into the test net. And what was great is once we opened that up, I think we had several hundred people that came right in. So obviously it seemed like we struck the right number on the 10,000. Not to mention the fact of if you look at our engaged community, these aren't speculators. That's people around the world who actually own and run hotspots. So in terms of how distributed HNT is around the world, that's kind of one of the things I think the network has to be proud of how many people could opt in because of how much the rewards had already been distributed. And you remember, Helium never had a pre-mine, so that all the HNT that existed has been mined by people who are hosting hotspots around the world. So I do think the network struck it correctly with that 10,000 HNT number. As far as the unbonding period, so that's 250,000 blocks or about 5 months. And it's interesting. It was a great discussion in the community because some people saw it as, like that's pretty long. I don't think it's too dissimilar from ETH2 if I'm remembering correctly, because I know they're a few months as well. But compared to some of the blockchains where the unbonding period is, days or weeks, I think that again, we really were trying to optimize for what people were really aligned with the long-term vision of Helium, who looked at this of not so much a negative of how much their tokens could be locked up again, but I think that's something that's tailored a little bit more towards speculators, where this is so much around security and long-term vision. Again, if I look at the response of the community and how many people have opted in to do this and had no issue with that type of unbonding period, it just speaks to what types of people are in our community, which is, again, for me, coming off of a few other projects, it's really interesting of how many people in the Helium community are not as, it's not the same as other DeFi ecosystems where it's a lot more crypto native, a lot more work on token infrastructure, where there's a lot of radio folks who are actually part of the Helium community. So some things, again, in terms of design, we wanted to be fitting for less crypto native types, but also at the same time, people who are really aligned with this long-term vision and who are so excited about the idea of building this decentralized peer-to-peer global network that was going to take time. So I think that unbonding period, and it reflects, I think, the values of the community. So those are kind of the two big pieces, I would say, as far as kind of like how we decide on those requirements as an ecosystem.
And I think you touched on two really important things there. The first is that Helium Network isn't driven by speculation, where maybe there are some others out there that can be. And I think that really comes down to the products that you have. And I think it's found product market fit. You have companies that are already using it, which is one of the rare ones in cryptocurrency where you can see something that's proven already today. Maybe for some of our listeners, so I believe I saw there's two phases in this proof of stake transition. There's a phase one, which is, we mentioned the 10,000 bond, the 5 month might be changed later, but the cool down period, And then we're interested as well. Has there been any talk of maybe even delegations in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, again, if you think about it, always comes back to it's a prioritization exercise of, there's an engineering team that can only do so much at a time. And, we want to get this out the door again. I think security and scalability were the absolute top priorities, and other features like delegation and slashing. I think for the most part, most of the community is on board with the idea. They see the value in those types of things. And it's not that there was pushback on it so much as just we wanted to get it out the door and get it running, and having validators on mainnet. So it's certainly something that I know there's interest in the community. It's something that will certainly go through our governance process, which we recently rolled out a couple of new changes there, again, in terms of how we think about distributing authority across the ecosystem. So I know those discussions will continue. It's just really a matter of working out the logistics of how we think about what are the rules around slashing and how is that enforced or not. Delegation, absolutely. I think that people are excited to think about how do we grow participation in the network? How do we make it easier for providers such as yourselves to operate more nodes? So certainly something, I think both of those are absolutely in the pipeline. It's just a matter of figuring out some of the details and just having the resource to actually build them out. But that's also areas where, we stood up our grant program earlier this year from the foundation side, and we've got a lot of great things getting funded on analytics and tools. I'm really excited for Batch 2 to see a little more things on token infrastructure. So, I think there's a lot of areas where people can help and get involved, not just mining and providing coverage, but a lot of areas where people can build and get into the community.
Yeah, that's maybe interesting. So you're saying basically there is like a chance, like for a grant to someone to build basically delegation into the protocol could definitely be something maybe like some of our listeners would be interested in. Of course, is there anything you can share on, like Helium doesn't have, or does it have like smart contract capabilities, or how would one go about building this if you have the information?
Yeah, I think that, and what I would say is I'll defer to the fact that we've got batch one of grants is closing up now. We'll have an announcement about that soon. I can tease out that we funded about $500,000 worth of grants in batch one, and again, like really great tools that are going to help on the developer side. I think the analytics really important. A couple of use cases that we're helping to stand up, but we'll have more information about batch two probably within the coming month as far as what we're looking for, the resources that are available to help on that. And again, just kind of more detail about the capabilities of the network. So more on that forthcoming, and kind of keeping an eye on either the DY or Helium socials, and we'll have that out soon.
No, for sure. Looking forward to hearing about that in the future as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see how rewards, change as the consensus group changes. But I have a feeling, as you scale and as more hotspots are added, I think it'll end up being, when delegation, etc., and even just normal bonding is added. Yeah, I mean, rewards should be relatively similar, if not better, potentially when the economics change. So yeah, I mean, we came across as well in our research that Helium are also thinking about this next phase almost for Helium, which is in 5G. I know that you're pretty excited about it over there as well. Would you mind just maybe touching upon that effort to go to 5G as well?
Yeah, certainly. And I think what's really cool about 5G is that is a completely community-led initiative. That was not something that came from within the foundation or the project team. And if I look at the network, the fact that there's already the fundamental value there, the fact that the blockchain is creating this incentive in the model for how you can deploy and stand up wireless networks, it only makes sense that the network and the community will continue to leverage that into the next network. So for 5G, and again, context for listeners here is 5G is incredibly expensive. So when you kind of look at it, it's very, very different from how LoRaWAN and IoT devices work as far as, all the existing legacy players, the fact that it's, you've really got this kind of oligopoly of, all these large enterprises have been around for a very, very long time. And if you think about physical networks being sometimes the strongest network to kind of break into, you kind of look around the world, and obviously there's different tower companies, there's carriers, there's network providers, there's virtual network providers. So very often, even when you're kind of on your phone, and it might say whether that's Vodafone, Orange, Deutsche Telekom, AT&T, Verizon, you're not necessarily actually connecting directly to a tower that's owned by that entity. Very often they're either leasing that from like an American tower, Crown Castle, They're often roaming onto other networks. So if you're in an airport and you're looking at people are probably familiar with like kind of like Boingo for in-flight Wi-Fi, but very often at airports, if you're still on an AT&T phone, you're actually roaming onto somebody else's network. So part of this is so much around where the big opportunity is for 5G is that again you have this same model of individuals can go and start deploying out coverage and creating infrastructure where the customer for that isn't necessarily somebody who you're not going to be dialing into your Helium 5G and kind of calling somebody that way, but it's an incredibly economically motivating way for carriers and providers to actually roam onto a network that is orders of magnitude cheaper than what they would have to do on their own. Again, thinking about standing up towers. And 5G being a much more high frequency, high throughput network. The example I sometimes use for people who are familiar with, so for New York, if you've got a tower on Fifth Avenue and Seventh Avenue, that might have covered you for 4G, but with 5G, you have to have a lot more density of coverage. So it's not just a matter of deploying on a network, but it's also the fact that how much you have to have more density than you've had in the past. So part of this is, again, it's cheaper for the carriers, but I think there's also a really important piece here from like societal benefit of carriers are always going to optimize for what is most beneficial to them from a bottom line perspective. So if you think about where those kind of pockets are, it might be where there's businesses, high value real estate. And what Helium enables, again, it's allowing that to be a decentralized peer-to-peer initiative where if you think about rural areas that might not be prioritized for coverage, those residents can effectively stand up that coverage themselves and earn on it. Same even in urban environments where if you have neighborhoods that might not be prioritized, those residents can be the ones to actually stand up the coverage, invest in it. They have the real, whether it's their roof, whether that's a window, to stand up the coverage and now actually benefit not just from the rewards of providing the infrastructure, but also the fact of what does that mean for the end businesses or the consumers that need to use that. So I think there's a real great internet for all narrative that comes along with Helium as a network moving into 5G. Freedom Fi, who's been working on open source 5G, leveraging the CBRS spectrum for a while, they're really the ones who kind of came to the network with this concept of, again, like they had designed everything around a gateway spectrum access, but it was, again, what's the incentive of how do you actually get rabid consumers to come in and like help stand up this infrastructure? And that's really what Helium provides, is this whole model around both the security and the incentives to stand up a network. So, and that some of the Freedom Fi's work came from Magma. Again, I think it was born from within Facebook. And again, it's all open source 5G initiatives and how you kind of expand coverage. But what was always missing, and it's true for the IoT networks too, is what's the incentive to really distribute that infrastructure stand up. So I think with 5G, it's great to be able to, again, leverage that same model, how much the network will benefit. Again, it just more on top of the fundamental value that Helium already has. When I talk to friends in traditional finance and it's, like, oh, there's nothing in blockchain that has fundamental value. I'm like, you look at Helium, like it's a network. People use it. It's out there. It exists. So I'm really excited to see where this goes. I know the community has absolutely gone crazy for it. Everybody wants to know when gateways are out, which again, I believe are slated for later this year. But I think it's going to be really fantastic, again, for the community to benefit more about the Helium story and how it applies to different networks. So I think it's going to be really fantastic overall. And again, I go back to this as a tide raising all boats. It's showing the utility of blockchains providing incentives for different networks.
No, I think, it's, I mean, IoT, 5G, cryptocurrency, you're definitely working with a few emerging technologies there and really proving the value of all of them, I think, at once, which is really, really nice to see. I think we might wrap it up today there, Scott, but thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, really, I mean, we're absolutely, excited to have Helium on as one of our networks where, we're really looking forward to what Helium does in the future with 5G and, everything else that you're doing with IoT devices. It's a really unique network. Really happy that we can support it. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else that you would like to sort of, where can people find you or Helium Network on socials maybe to find out more about Helium?
Yeah, so again, the two organizations. So Helium is the project team. So it's just at Helium on Twitter. You can also follow the DY Alliance, which is we act as the Helium Foundation, so overseeing everything around governance, really network advocacy and growth. You can check out the Helium Discord, which I can share the links with you guys for that as well. It's a really, really wonderful, deeply engaged, thoughtful community on how we're thinking about growing this, and it's great to be part of a project where so many initiatives and so much of the advancement is community led. So I think where a lot of blockchains are kind of looking for the hammer looking for a nail, it's Helium really is something that was a problem before crypto even existed. In terms of having a network for these low power devices, having a way for people to actually stand up and be part of that infrastructure and benefit from it. The fact that this is not a dream of something to come and a promise for something, it's the dream is reality now. It's live, it exists, people are using it. And I would just say as kind of we move into validators, really also grateful for Chorus One to be part of the community now and participating. You guys have done great work with other chains, and to have you in the Helium community now is we really appreciate it. So also want to say thanks to you guys.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And yeah, I totally agree. I remember with the hammer and the nail, I actually wanted to make a comment earlier about this. We've been reading like white papers in 2017 about these use cases and like some vague ideas. And it's really cool to see that some of these actually now are happening. Maybe not on these projects that wrote the white papers initially, but instead on the Helium network. So yeah, we're really excited to support it from our side. And great to have you on. And yeah,
Wonderful.
we'll put all the links in the show notes for our listeners so they can catch up on Helium.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Great to be on today.
Scott, thanks so much, mate.
All right. Cheers.